On September 12th, Unity had announced changes to their pricing plan/models, and I'm not going to get too much into details here, but the whole gaming dev community was outraged and furious for all the right reasons. The whole community stood together and voiced their opinions, along with some big name mobile games publishers that would be heavily affected by this, wrote a collective letter to Unity, which eventually led to some changes being made to the pricing models, but it was too late. A lot of the developers had started looking at alternative game engines, and the one that was a top choice among the majority was the Godot game engine, mainly due to it being open source, which means it's fully community driven and funded. So with that said, I decided to try Godot, but with a twist. I wanted to know how different Godot would be compared to Unity, and this led to a challenge. To make a simple falling sphere scene in Godot with no help whatsoever. This meant diving straight into the engine without learning any of the basics. Sounds pretty tough, right? But my thought process was,
how hard can it be?
Here's how it went. Opening up Godot, I was met with a project manager, which is basically like Unity Hub. The next thing that stood out to me was that we have to select the render type before creating the project. I would say there are some pros and cons to this. I don't know if you can change this in the project later on, but let me know in the comments how this works. You can also select version control metadata, which I think is a neat feature. Creating and loading a project for the first time is actually pretty fast compared to Unity. It took about 16 seconds with a forward renderer project, which I believe is the most heaviest compared to the other renderers. But again, if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. Right, we're finally in Godot. First impressions are pretty normal actually. We have a few different windows/tabs as expected. Nothing particularly standing out, which is a good thing. Something I noticed after recording was that I forgot to check out the project settings, tools, editor settings, among a few other settings, but it was okay since I believe those settings are for customization and advanced uses and not required for my simple challenge. Starting off, I couldn't find a pre-made sphere object like in Unity, but I did find a 3D object which is called Node 3D. I thought this was like an empty game object, so I just had to add a sphere mesh and physics to this object to complete my challenge, but this took quite some time because I couldn't really figure out how to add said components. Eventually, after about 5 minutes, I was able to move in the right direction. So basically, I had to add a child node instead of trying to add a mesh to the Node 3D object itself. And what I hadn't realized previously is that the Node 3D has a drop-down menu where I can find all the properties, components that I need to add. And this realization was pretty embarrassing. But even after adding a mesh instance, there was no mesh. Luckily, this time it didn't take too long to find where I had to assign the sphere mesh. After that, I played around with the axis movements as I've heard that Godot has a slightly different coordinate system. Next, I checked out the base material/shader properties, and for some reason I wasn't expecting to see advanced properties like subsurface scattering on the standard shader, but it turns out that wasn't the case, which was pretty cool. I didn't mess around too much with the material and just gave a simple green color to the sphere. Moving on, I realized that unlike Unity, I had to add a camera and light to the scene manually. Another thing I became curious about was that I was only able to add objects to the scene as a child node of the Node 3D object. I really don't know if this is the right way to set up nodes, and there's a very high chance that I'm doing it wrong. But I've heard that the node system is actually pretty great when you know what you're doing, so I just let things be because nothing was broken yet. With the camera in place, I had to add a light to the scene, but for some reason that I don't remember, I created a light map GI node instead of a directional light node. I still don't remember why I did that, but it led to circling around until I figured out that wasn't the right type of light setup, and by now even you might have noticed the pattern of me making simple avoidable mistakes, but I think that's pretty normal when you're learning something new. Finally, it was time for the last step, which was adding physics to the sphere. This was relatively easy as Godot has a rigidbody 3D node similar to Unity, and after adding the mesh as a child of the rigidbody node, the challenge was completed. Well, kind of, as you can see that the sphere wasn't really falling in the correct direction. I'm not sure if this was a camera setup problem or a coordinate system thing that I talked about earlier, but I decided to not go any further as I was satisfied with the results, and also it would be best to learn the game engine before going any deeper. Speaking of learning, there are various ways to learn Godot. If you like to read, then you can go through the official documentation. If you prefer videos, then there are free courses on YouTube as well by Free Code Camp and Clear Code. And lastly, if you like to learn through experimentation, then you can also try the 20 games challenge, but personally, I wouldn't really recommend this. My first impression and the best thing that I liked about Godot with my limited knowledge and experience is how lightweight the engine is compared to Unity. I'm not gonna get into the loading time issues of Unity here, but the engine felt super fast with a very smooth workflow environment. Closing off with, if you're a Godot dev, then I'm sure that this video either made you laugh or was painful to watch, and if you're a Unity dev, then you may relate to my experience. Either ways, let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.